Well, will cooler head prevail? That is the question, really. To answer better about that question, I'm joined by Mr. Zhang Yunshe, who is from the China's Navy Research Institute. Mr. Zhang is now in Singapore attending the Shangri-La Dialogue over there. Mr. Zhang, welcome to our program. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., we have Mr. David Sidney, who previously served as America's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Welcome as well, Mr. Sidney. First of all, we all heard just now Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, talking about the issue of peace and stability in the region. One of the things he's been talking about is to break, quote unquote, the vicious cycle. Of course, the vicious cycle has been talking about the security issues and the territorial disputes inside the region. Mr. Zhang, from China's perspective, particularly Chinese military's perspective, what do you think about the possibility of breaking, quote unquote, this vicious cycle?
Well, actually, to some extent, we can say that there is a deficit of trust between the two sides. For the Chinese part, many Chinese people think that the Americans are using the maritime dispute between China and its neighbors as a tool to contain China. But the United States says it will not take sides in maritime disputes in this area, especially concerning their sovereignty. And the United States is concerned about the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. But China says that freedom of navigation and overflight has never been a problem. So I think the two sides should communicate more, that is, to hold more dialogues between the two sides to decrease the misunderstanding between the two sides.
Mr. Sidney, is it an issue of communication?
I have lost audio.
Okay, you have lost audio. Well, we'll come back to you later.
Hello.
We'll come back to you later. Since you cannot hear us at the moment, I hope the technician will adjust that. But Mr. Zhang, let me follow up with you when you just said something related to the U.S.-China relations. But you know, this is not just U.S.-China relations. It is also some of the territorial disputes that China has with its neighboring countries. For example, the Philippines, for example, Vietnam. What do you think about this layer of issues? Will that so-called vicious cycle be broken at the same time?
Well, I think the maritime disputes between China and some of its neighbors, especially some of the Southeast Asian countries, such as the Philippines, has existed for a long time. And this problem has been raised by the Philippines and other countries, not China, because we have seen that over the years, China has insisted that such kind of disputes should be resolved through consultations and negotiations between China and other countries. But the Philippines has broken its promise to send this to international arbitration, which is against the spirit of the DOC, Declaration on the Conduct of Parties, signed between China and ASEAN countries, including the Philippines, which stipulates that such kind of disputes should be resolved through consultations and negotiations. So I think the Philippines have broken its promise in such kind of maritime disputes.
All right, I am told that Mr. Sidney can hear us better. Mr. Sidney, welcome back. First of all, you want to respond to the lack of mutual trust between China and the United States, and therefore, according to Mr. Zhang, has brought over another layer of difficulties of resolving some of the territorial disputes China has with its neighboring countries. Mr. Sidney.
Well, I apologize I wasn't able to hear his presentation, but let me say I don't think the issue here is really one of trust. It's an issue of different worldviews. China and the United States see the situation in the South China Sea differently from an international legal perspective. The United States' focus is very much on freedom of navigation and on correct definition of territorial waters in accordance with international law as practiced over the last several centuries. Therefore, it's not an issue of trust, it's an issue of different views. The various bilateral disputes are, in the U.S. view, subservient to the overall issue of freedom of navigation. That is the key issue. So from the United States perspective, the U.S. will always focus on the issue of freedom of navigation, including overflight above the seas and undersea passage under the seas.
Okay.
The problem with what China is doing is that what China is doing is attempting to restrict that freedom of navigation. If China were to make a clear, unambiguous statement that the current situation of freedom of navigation will persist and there will be no changes to that, then the situation would be different. But so far, China has refused to acknowledge the freedom of navigation concerns that the United States has.
Mr. Sidney, may I just follow up on what you just said? Well, it is important what the U.S. has in mind in terms of opinion of things going on in the region, but at the same time, many people have been suggesting this is an issue between China and the neighboring countries which have territorial disputes with China. Will the U.S. role ever complicating the situation or actually aid to the solutions of the already complicated issue? Briefly from you, sir.
You're correct that it's a complicated issue, and yes, there are competing bilateral claims. But again, the most important issue is the overriding international legal issue of freedom of navigation. The individual bilateral claims that the United States does not take a position on are separate from and distinct from freedom of navigation. And it confuses things when people switch the argument to the various bilateral disputes. Those should be discussed between China and the Philippines, etc. But from the United States perspective, we are concerned about freedom of navigation. And that's where China is trying to change the situation on the ground.
We heard you very clearly. Now, should we have Mr. Zhang to respond to what Mr. Sidney just argued? Namely, it is a freedom of navigation issue. But Mr. Zhang, I also understand China has its own interpretation about what the freedom of navigation is. So you want to respond to what Mr. Sidney just said?
Well, I think China's position is clear and consistent. That is, the freedom of navigation and overflight enjoyed by all countries, including the United States, should be fully guaranteed. And the fact is, for the last decades, several decades, freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea has been kept and has never been a problem. So many Chinese think that the United States is making the freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea as an excuse for it to interfere in the South China Sea problem. Because the United States actually is an outsider of the maritime disputes in this region. So it should keep neutral and keep its promise not to take sides in these disputes.
If Mr. Zhang, you are saying the United States should keep neutral, then what about China's actions in the near future? For example, at this moment, I understand China has been discussing and also negotiations with relevant countries about the code of conduct in the South China Sea, which might help to avoid any crisis if the territorial disputes cannot be resolved, at least for now. So what about the process of code of conduct doing so far? Will that help us to break this so-called vicious cycle? How is it proceeding right now, Mr. Zhang?
Well, ever since China and ASEAN countries, including the Philippines, signed the DOC in 2002, China has been following the spirit of the DOC, and China has exercised great restraint concerning the maritime disputes. But some countries, especially the Philippines, has made constantly or continuous provocations against China. We see that in 2012, it used the warship to harass and threaten the Chinese fishing boat in the Huangyan Island. And also it made a provision of law to include some of the South China Sea as its territorial sea. And this has violated the spirit of the DOC. And also we can see that the Philippines has been building many military facilities in the islands it has illegally occupied from China. These islands belong to China. We have we have enough evidence, historically or legally, to prove these islands belong to China. But China has exercised great restraint.
Well, Mr. Zhang, I heard your argument very clearly, but here's the thing. The Philippines have been portraying itself in front of the international community as, quote unquote, a victim or a weaker party of the overall territorial disputes with China. So was Vietnam some time ago. So many would argue this thing has to be resolved, not depends on the national strength and the military power of a country, but rather, quote unquote, with international accepted principles. Here's the issue, Mr. Zhang. What is the most important thing? Principles or national strength in this regard? And secondly, if principle coincides with national strength, is it going to be a mistake? Or when principles coincide with national strength, and it could be a result that the international community can accept. I mean, when it comes to territorial dispute between the Philippines and China. Mr. Zhang.
Well, China has never tried to use force or threat of force in settling such disputes with other countries, including the Philippines. Actually, the Philippines has violated the principle of DOC, which stipulates that such kind of disputes should be resolved through negotiations, not going to international arbitration. So I think the Philippines has violated the principle. So
let me ask the same. Let me ask the same.
Fault.
Let me ask the same question also to Mr. Sidney.
Yes.
I understand you didn't hear us very well earlier, Mr. Sidney, so let me repeat humbly the question again to you. The question is, people have been looking at the Philippines as if it is the weaker party in the overall dispute of territory between the Philippines and China. But China argues this is not an issue of national strength, but rather of principles. And the principles, international law, are on the Chinese side. So my question to you, Mr. Sidney, is, can the international community, United States included, look at issues not just as, quote unquote, the weaker and stronger parties, but rather look at the principles and how the international principles are being portrayed and being interpreted by countries involved? Mr. Sidney.
Thank you. First, I need to respond to one of the things that my colleague in Beijing
Go
said.
ahead.
China's position on freedom of navigation has been neither clear nor consistent, and we're happy to talk more about that. On the issue of the Philippines is, I think, doing the right thing by going to the International Court of Justice, and that is the way to resolve disputes between countries. The idea that one country can tell another country not to go to the Court of Justice is, I think, something contrary to the current rules of international law. So it's less a question of strength and weakness rather than it's a question of following an accepted international order that has been highly beneficial, as Premier Shin said in his speech that you showed at the beginning. The current world order has been very beneficial to China. So if China continues to support that international order and accepts the ruling of the International Court of Justice on this sovereignty issue, then everybody will be better off.
Okay, Mr. Zhang, so who interpret what the meanings of so-called international principles are? Will a court necessarily going to do that? Will the Philippines bringing the case to the court necessarily going to do that? Will China's interpretation of what the international principles are be able to be communicated to the others? Mr. Zhang.
Yes, well, I think China has been abiding strictly by the international law. And also we can see that DOC is also a policy or like a treaty between the countries. And the Philippines actually agreed to the bilateral negotiations when it signed the DOC. So now it sent it to the international arbitration. So without consulting with China. So actually this is a fact that the Philippines has broken its promise, and China will absolutely not respond to its illegal act. And here I want to say that actually to many Chinese, the United States here is stirring up the trouble and is encouraging the Philippines to make provocations against China. And the United States is taking a double standard toward China and the Philippines and Vietnam, other claimants in this dispute, because we see that